Jimi Hendrix faced these legends and history never told. Introduction: The Untold Battles of a Guitar God. Before Jimi Hendrix became the undisputed master of the electric guitar, before Woodstock immortalized his name, and before Purple Haze became the anthem of a generation, there was a warrior walking through the smoke-filled clubs of London and New York. This warrior carried a weapon that would change music forever. A Fender Stratocaster turned upside down, defying every convention of what a guitar could do. But what history books rarely tell you is that Jimi didn't just revolutionize music in a vacuum. He faced down the greatest guitar players of his era in legendary confrontations that would make or break careers. These weren't just jam sessions. They were battles for supremacy, moments where reputations hung in the balance, and the future of rock music was being forged note by note, riff by riff, in front of stunned audiences who barely understood what they were witnessing. This is the story of those encounters. The nights when legends collided, when egos were shattered, and when one man with a guitar changed everything. These are the battles history forgot, but the music world never will. The night Eric Clapton watched his crown slip away. London, October 1966. The Polytechnic of Central London was packed with Britain's rock elite. Eric Clapton, recently dubbed God by adoring fans who spray-painted the title across London's walls, was at the peak of his powers with Cream. The British blues scene had crowned him king, and no one, absolutely no one, was expected to challenge that throne. Then Chas Chandler walked in with a stranger. The stranger was tall, lean, with a wild afro and clothes that looked like they'd been assembled from a fever dream. His name was Jimi Hendrix, and he'd just arrived from America via Chandler, the former bassist of the Animals who'd discovered him playing in a dingy Greenwich Village club. Chandler had been making bold promises. Wait until you see what he can do with a guitar. The British blues purists were skeptical. Americans playing blues. They'd heard it all before, competent perhaps, but lacking the raw authenticity that British musicians had somehow claimed as their birthright. Clapton himself was curious but unconcerned. After all, he was God. Jimi plugged in. What happened next would be recounted in whispers for decades. Jimi didn't just play guitar, he became it. His fingers danced across the fretboard with impossible speed and precision. He played behind his back, between his legs, with his teeth. But these weren't cheap tricks. Every note was perfect, every bend intentional, every feedback squeal controlled with surgical precision. He launched into Killing Floor, a Howlin' Wolf blues standard that the British musicians thought they owned. But Jimi tore it apart and reassembled it into something completely alien. The guitar screamed, wept, laughed, and raged. He incorporated distortion, feedback, and wah-wah effects that no one had heard used that way before. The instrument in his hands wasn't just making music. It was having a conversation with the universe. Clapton stood frozen, his cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. Witnesses later reported seeing the color drain from his face. Cream drummer Ginger Baker turned to someone and muttered, "We might as well pack it in now." When Jimi finished, the room erupted. But Clapton had already left the building. Years later, Clapton would finally admit what happened that night. "I thought I was the best guitarist in the world until I saw Jimi Hendrix." He went home that evening and didn't touch his guitar for weeks, plunged into a crisis of confidence that would reshape his entire approach to music. But for Jimi, it was just the beginning. He fired the opening shot in a war he didn't even know he was fighting. A war against every guitarist who thought they'd mastered the instrument. If you're amazed by what Jimi did to Clapton, subscribe to discover more untold music legends. This story gets even wilder. Monterey, California, June 18, 1967. The Monterey Pop Festival was meant to be America's introduction to the new wave of psychedelic rock. The Who were set to close the festival with their legendary destructive performance art. But there was a problem. Jimi Hendrix was also on the bill, and neither he nor Pete Townshend wanted to follow the other. This wasn't just about stage order. This was about dominance. The Who had built their reputation on chaos. Smashing guitars, destroying drum kits, and creating controlled mayhem that left audiences breathless. Pete Townshend's windmill guitar strokes and violent instrument destruction had become iconic. They were the ultimate showmen, and no one could top their theatrical ferocity. Or so they thought. Backstage, the tension was electric. Both bands knew that whoever went second would have to destroy the other's performance to be remembered. A coin toss decided it. The Who would go first. Townshend smiled. They'd blow everyone away, and Hendrix would be left trying to pick up the pieces. The Who's performance was apocalyptic. Townshend smashed his guitar with primal fury. Keith Moon kicked over his drums. Smoke bombs exploded. The stage looked like a war zone. The crowd was stunned into euphoric chaos. As they left the stage, Townshend reportedly smirked at Jimi, "Follow that." But Jimi Hendrix didn't follow anything. He transcended it. When Jimi took the stage in his psychedelic military jacket and feathered hat, he didn't start with destruction. He started with seduction. Wild Thing began as a slow burn. Jimi coaxing sounds from his guitar that seemed to come from another dimension. Had played with his teeth, his elbows, behind his head. But every note was intentional, every moment building towards something the audience couldn't yet comprehend. Then, as the song reached its climax, Jimi did something no one had ever seen before. He knelt before his guitar, which he'd laid on the stage. He poured lighter fluid over it. The crowd gasped. He set it on fire. But here's what made it different from The Who's destruction. Jimi didn't just destroy his instrument. He sacrificed it. He caressed the burning guitar, coaxed final notes from it as the flames consumed it, treating it like a living thing dying in his arms. He smashed it, threw the pieces into the audience, and walked off stage, leaving behind smoke, fire, and a stunned silence that erupted into the loudest ovation of the festival. Backstage, Pete Townshend watched on a monitor. His face was unreadable. Later he'd say, "I regret not watching Jimi's performance from the crowd." He redefined what it meant to perform. But it wasn't just Townshend who was affected. In the audience that night was a young musician who'd been struggling with his own guitar playing. His name was Carlos Santana, and he later said that watching Jimi that night was like seeing music itself given human form. "I realized the guitar had no limits. Only the limits we place on ourselves." Jimi had won again, but the cost was mounting. Each performance demanded something more extreme, more transcendent. He was creating expectations he'd have to meet again and again, burning himself out as surely as he'd burned that Stratocaster. This was just Monterey. Drop a comment below telling me which Hendrix performance blew your mind the most. And wait until you hear what happened in New York. This is the battle that almost no one knows about. Because it happened behind closed doors in New York's underground scene during, Nove, Size, Nove, Nove, Sete, Zero. It wasn't fought in front of thousands. It was an intimate war waged in recording studios and secret jam sessions between two titans from different worlds, Jimi Hendrix and Miles Davis. Miles Davis was already a legend, having revolutionized jazz multiple times over. But by the late 60s, he was obsessed with rock music. Specifically, with what Jimi Hendrix was doing. He saw in Jimi's playing something that transcended rock, a jazz sensibility buried under distortion and feedback, an improvisational genius that spoke Miles' language. They met through mutual connections in New York's music scene. Miles, never one for small talk, got straight to the point. "You play too many notes. You hide behind all that noise." Jimi, who'd faced down Clapton and The Who, was taken aback. No one criticized his playing, they worshipped it. But Miles wasn't just anyone. "Show me what you mean," Jimi replied. What followed were a series of jam sessions that witnesses described as two masters speaking different languages, trying to find common ground. Miles would play his trumpet, stark, minimal, every note mattering, and challenged Jimi to respond with the same economy. Jimi, used to filling every space with sound, struggled at first. But genius adapts. Gradually, Jimi began to strip away the excess. He started finding the silence between notes, the power of restraint. Miles pushed him to explore jazz fusion, to think of the guitar not as a rock instrument but as a voice in conversation with horns, keyboards, and avant-garde rhythms. Recordings from these sessions exist, but remain largely unreleased. Fragmented, experimental, and unlike anything Jimi released commercially. They show an artist evolving, pushing beyond the boundaries of rock into something entirely new. Jimi began working on what would become his final, unfinished album. A fusion project that would have changed music history. Miles later said, "Jimi could have been the greatest jazz guitarist ever. He had the ears, the touch, the soul. But he died before he could get there." The tragedy is that this battle wasn't won or lost. It was interrupted. On September 18, 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London at age 27, leaving behind sketches of a musical evolution that would never be completed. Miles went on to create fusion masterpieces like Bitches Brew, incorporating the rock elements Jimi had embodied, but always wondering what they could have created together. Other musicians who witnessed these sessions, including John McLaughlin, who'd play on Bitches Brew, spoke of Jimi's final months as a time of transformation. He was tired of being the guitar god who set instruments on fire. He wanted to be a musician, exploring the infinite possibilities of sound. Everyone wanted the Monterey Jimi, McLaughlin recalled. But Jimi wanted to be the musician he was becoming with Miles. The world wasn't ready for that version of him. Hit that like button if this story of Jimi and Miles gave you chills. The final confrontation is something you won't believe. Isle of Wight, August 30, 1970. It would be Jimi Hendrix's last major performance. Over 600 people gathered on a British island to see the legends of rock. But behind the scenes, Jimi was fighting a battle no one could see. A war with himself. The pressures had been mounting for years. Every performance demanded that he top himself. Audiences didn't just want music. They wanted transcendence, wanted him to burn guitars, play with his teeth, channel the gods themselves. The music industry wanted hits. His bandmates wanted stability. His management wanted money. But Jimi just wanted to play. The Isle of Wight performance exposed this internal conflict in real time. Jimi took the stage at 2 a.m. hours late to an exhausted and hostile crowd. He was unfocused, his playing erratic. The magic that had destroyed Clapton, outlasted The Who, and impressed Miles Davis seemed gone. Critics called it a disaster. Hendrix looked lost, wrote one reviewer. Like a man going through the motions of being himself, but looking back through the recordings, something else emerges. In his improvised solos that night, Jimi was playing something different. Hints of the fusion work with Miles, mellower tones, exploratory passages that weren't about showmanship but about pure musical expression. The crowd wanted the warrior who'd conquered London and Monterey. Jimi was offering them the artist he was becoming. They rejected it. In the final weeks of his life, Jimi became increasingly withdrawn. He spoke to friends about leaving rock behind, about starting fresh, about making music for me, not for them. He was exhausted from being a legend, from the impossible expectations, from having to be Jimi Hendrix every single moment. September 18, 1970, a hotel room in London. Jimi Hendrix, just 27 years old, dies from asphyxiation after mixing sleeping pills with wine. The official verdict is accidental death, though conspiracy theories and alternative explanations persist to this day. But perhaps the real tragedy isn't how he died. It's that his final battle, the one against the crushing weight of his own legend, was one he couldn't win. Unlike Clapton, who could retreat and reinvent himself, unlike The Who, who could smash guitars and move on, unlike Miles, who had decades to evolve, Jimi was trapped in amber. Forever the wild genius of Monterey, never allowed to become whoever he might have been next. The legacy. Eric Clapton went on to a legendary career, but every time he picks up a guitar, he thinks about that night in 1966. Pete Townshend's destructive performances became iconic, but he knew Monterey belonged to Jimi. Miles Davis's fusion revolution bore Jimi's fingerprints on every note. And countless guitarists. Stevie Ray Vaughan, Eddie Van Halen, Prince, John Frusciante, built their entire careers on the foundation Jimi laid. But the man himself never got to see where his journey would end. He died mid-evolution, mid-transformation, with his greatest work potentially still ahead of him. The saddest part. Jimi Hendrix won every battle against other legends, but lost the war against time, expectation, and the prison of his own genius. Epilogue. The Unfinished Symphony. In archives and private collections, recordings still surface. Fragments of Jimi's final sessions, collaborations that never saw the light, experimental tracks that hint at the artist he was becoming. Music historians debate what his next album would have sounded like, what direction he would have taken rock music if he'd lived. But we'll never know. What we do know is this: Jimi Hendrix didn't just play guitar. He redefined what the instrument could be. He didn't just face legends. He became one by refusing to play by anyone else's rules. And the battles he fought, won, and ultimately lost weren't just about music. They were about the cost of genius, the burden of innovation, and the tragedy of burning too bright too fast. Every guitarist who's picked up a Stratocaster since 1970 is playing in Jimi's shadow. Every musician who's pushed boundaries, incorporated feedback, or treated their instrument like a living extension of themselves owes him a debt. Every time someone says, "That's impossible on guitar," they're proven wrong by a ghost who made the impossible his daily routine. Jimi Hendrix faced the greatest legends of his era and won every time, except when he faced the legend he'd created himself. And maybe that's the lesson. The greatest battles aren't against other people. They're against who the world demands you be versus who you're trying to become. The music remains. The legend grows. And somewhere in the spaces between the notes, Jimi Hendrix is still playing, still evolving, still searching for that perfect sound that would have defined whatever came next. Subscribe, like, and comment with your favorite Jimi Hendrix moment. Which legendary guitarist do you think came closest to matching him? Let's keep this conversation alive, because as long as we're talking about Jimi, the music never dies.